Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak with each one to one. Each of us has vivid images of the late Julia Child, whether we were struggling with one of her recipes or watching The French Chef or Julie and Julia starring Meryl Streep. But the writer Jennet Conant, author of, among others, The Irregulars, Roald Dahl, and The British Spy Ring in Wartime Washington, brings us the Julia Child who was beginning to find her niche in life when she joined the OSS during World War II and experienced a world far from her native Pasadena. The result? A Covert Affair, Julia Child and Paul Child in the OSS. It's just been published by Simon & Schuster. Welcome.
Thank you.
Your book explores a side of Julia Child that a lot of people know nothing about. Basically, her adventures as an agent with the U.S. Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and how she and her former OSS colleagues, including her husband, Paul Child, were affected by the communist witch hunt after the war. What made you decide to write this book?
Well, I just finished a book about the OSS, the early days of our first overseas intelligence service, and that was the British spy ring book, The Irregulars, that you mentioned. And the OSS declassified a huge cache of secret documents about this period, and it revealed the names and identities of a lot of individuals who had served their country during the war that Americans knew nothing about. And Julia Child's name was among them, and everywhere I went, at the book signings, dozens and dozens of people came up to me and said, was Julia Child a spy? What did she do? What does this have to do with cooking? And the obvious fascination was just clear to me, and I started doing research. And when I saw what had happened to her and what she went through and how brave she was, I became intrigued, and I decided to do the book.
So what was the mission of the Office of Strategic Services?
Well, it was our first foreign intelligence service. We didn't have one before World War II. We just had the FBI, and that was really a domestic police force. So when the early days of the war started, the British were begging us to have an overseas intelligence service because we had Nazi spies coming into America and South America, building networks, doing all kinds of industrial espionage. Remember, all kinds of chemicals, oil, gas. We know about that now. Were being shipped. Money was changing hands. And they needed America to be alert and to help them, even if we weren't in the war. And we didn't have any kind of intelligence gathering service. So President Roosevelt, in the early days of the war, approved the formation of the OSS. And William Donovan, Colonel William Donovan, this very charismatic Irish Catholic.
Also known as Wild Bill Donovan.
Wild Bill Donovan, much decorated World War I hero, headed up the agency and started hiring like mad all these people to really build up this intelligence gathering bureaucracy overnight. And he hired the most eclectic group of people, and that was the OSS.
You say it was really an eclectic assortment of people, with an eclectic assortment of skills as well. What kinds of types?
You know, it was fascinating because the kind of people that would have been hired to do intelligence were already working for the military and Navy.
Okay.
So he had to sort of spread out and look elsewhere for talent. And he went, you know, like most lawyers, he hired other lawyers. So most of the people who ran the OSS were from his own Wall Street firm and others. But then he went to academia and he hired all kinds of people, mathematicians, psychologists, anthropologists. If you were an ornithologist and you had chased a rare bird across Burma, you became head of the Burma section desk. I mean, if you had a language, you became head of that country. You know, because we needed people in India, in China, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. And in those days, Americans didn't necessarily speak those languages. So he hired archaeologists and all kinds of people because they had the language skills and they had done a dig there and they knew the terrain and they had local contacts. So it was very eclectic group, to say the least. And then, you know, he needed a bureaucratic staff. And so if they had a sister or a girlfriend that had gone to a good college that could type, who was reliable, she would be brought in as the administrative skill. And so a lot of women from Seven Sisters colleges were recruited.
So you had a lot of Ivy League Seven Sister types.
Yes, the joke was Ivy League and Junior League.
Okay, and they're mostly white.
Yes, oh sure.
Upper middle class.
Yes.
A lot of socially connected.
Yes. Partly, in his defense, very few Americans traveled. We were just coming out of the Depression, and the few Americans that would have traveled were probably wealthy in those days because it took a lot of money. You went by boat, you were gone for weeks and weeks. And so to have people with language skills and knowledge of foreign countries tended to be wealthy Americans.
You also had a lot of young people who were basically rebelling against their upper class backgrounds, right? Maybe wanting to escape their hometown.
Well, you had to have adventurous people. I mean, obviously, if you were very much a button-down conservative type, you were not going to let your daughter go globetrotting around Asia during the war. So you did have a sort of a more bohemian element. There were a lot of sort of radicals, a lot of intellectuals, definitely more of an adventurous strain.
So how did Paul Child and Julia McWilliams wind up in OSS, and what were their jobs?
Well, they were both recruited through these various networks. Julia, because of her family connection, she was a wealthy California girl from a very conservative family. She fit the bill. She'd gone to Smith, and she was recruited. She landed in Donovan's office and then was sent to Ceylon. Paul Child was really much more of an eclectic hire. He had dropped out of college. He was a self-trained artist, but he was a brilliant artist, very good at diagrams. He could make topographical maps out of modeling clay, and he was so good at it that he was recruited by the wartime generals to build their war rooms, and he was sent to Ceylon. So they met in Ceylon in a very small mountaintop resort in Kandy, which was the OSS headquarters in that part of the world, in the China, Burma, India Theater, as it was known then. And they were both serving General Wedemeyer at the moment.
And Julia's, I mean, Paul was making maps and drawings and doing that kind of thing. Her job was more mundane. It was basically filing and organizing dispatches and that kind of thing.
Yes, in the beginning,
Orders.
but it was really quite an important job. She ran the OSS registry, and that was the brain bank, and that was where every classified document came through. So all of the future invasion plans, everything from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, every eyes-only telegram. She knew where all the OSS missions were. She knew the names and aliases of all their double agents working behind enemy lines. And then more than that, they were collecting intelligence from their field missions all over Asia. And those reports were coming in, all kinds of information about the location of Japanese troops, shipping of oil, shipping of rubber, shipping of tin, all kinds of valuable wartime materials. And she had to have that information at her fingertips.
Okay.
So
she
really
knew where
had,
all the bodies and the tin
and she knew where all the bodies were buried, and she really was good at it. And by the end, she was running a huge operation with a staff of something like 6. She was very good.
Could one call them spies, or were they more like undercover agents?
Intelligence officers.
Okay, okay. And their job was, I mean, the job of OSS in general and of a lot of the officers was basically to spread misinformation, to mislead to undermine the enemy, right?
Yes, one of the major departments of the OSS was propaganda and subversion. And they called it morale operations, which is a great name, but really what it meant was undermining the morale of the enemy. And under those categories, what they did was a lot of misinformation. They developed most of these tactics during the European phase of the war, and then they applied them in the Pacific. For example, in the European part of the war, they would mimic German radio stations. They would put out identical broadcasts as the German broadcasts. And then they would just introduce misinformation, talking about losses at the front and unrest in Germany and hunger strikes to reduce the morale of the German troops. It worked so well, they did the same thing in Asia. They would create these ghost radio stations that would broadcast information to the Japanese troops, telling them of unhappiness, unrest at home, starvation in the lines, huge losses, to try and demoralize the Japanese troops that were in Burma, occupying different territories in Southeast Asia. They would plant leaflets saying that the food was poisoned, so they wouldn't be able to eat anything local. All that kind of thing to try and undermine the troops.
Now, as you said, Paul and Julia met in Ceylon. The conditions in the OSS compound there were, well, difficult at times. There were diseases.
Lots of diseases, yeah.
There was a lot of bad weather. But there was sometimes some good housing, right?
Yeah, it was a very funny. Their first post was not a hardship post. Ceylon was a beautiful old tea planter's oasis. So, you know, it looked gorgeous. She stayed in a ramshackle old British colonial hotel. You know, it was enormous, looked like a wedding cake. It had 4-poster beds, that kind of thing. And the actual headquarters was on an old tea plantation with bamboo huts, and there was a grass tennis court. So it all looked very picturesque. But the fact of the matter is it was often very unpleasant. You know, Americans were not suited for that kind of food. We didn't have the kinds of stomachs that could tolerate it. They all got desperately ill with all kinds of terrible infections. Paul Child lost 35 pounds. They had dysentery forever. They got dengue fever. Julia got desperately ill with dengue fever, which was very painful. High fever. She was sick in bed in the infirmary for something like 3.5 weeks. And then they would get illness after illness after illness. There were monsoons, there were mud, there were all kinds of insects, mosquitoes everywhere. It was tough.
So they weren't under fire, but they were under fire from the elements.
Yeah, though when she was posted to China, it got even worse. The conditions, she was in a very remote part of China behind enemy lines at the foot of the Burma Road, and there it got very rough. Not only did the diseases get worse, there was a cholera epidemic, and she saw the dead bodies floating down the river every morning past her office, but there they did encounter fighting because the Chinese Civil War was encroaching on their compound, and she awoke one morning to gunmen in the bedroom. So she got very close to the fighting in China.
We have to take a short break. Then we'll be back with more with Jennet Conant, author of A Covert Affair, Julia Child and Paul Child in the OSS.
John can hold his daughter. Marilyn can laugh with her sons. Raphael can play with his sister. Gregory can fly. None of this would have been possible without an organ donor. Keep life going. Sign up to be an organ donor today. You can register when you renew your driver's license or online at savelivesnewyork.org. The more New Yorkers who sign up, the more lives saved. One of them could be someone you love.
Here we go. What? What?
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent, because kids in foster care don't need perfection. They need you.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Jennet Conant, author of A Covert Affair, Julia Child and Paul Child in the OSS. It's just been published by Simon & Schuster. There were a lot of interesting characters at the OSS compound in Ceylon, and one of them was Jane Foster. Tell us about her.
Well, Jane Foster fascinated me because in many ways she was the mirror image of Julia. Like Julia, she was a California girl from a wealthy conservative family. She'd gone to a good woman's college. She was educated, but she was very different politically. And this is where, in the book, I think, you know, character becomes destiny, because she was extremely bold, very adventurous. She was actually being trained as a counterintelligence agent to go behind enemy lines. She spoke a number of languages, and she was going to be sent behind lines in Burma and then in Malaya and then later in Saigon. She was very, very brave at the end of the war, but that same characteristic, that recklessness, that adventurousness, would later get her into enormous trouble in the 1950s and get Julia and Paul into trouble. So she was a very interesting character, and their relationship, the three of them, was central to the book.
Now, when she was sent to, I guess it was Java after Japan's surrender, she was really appalled by the behavior of the Europeans and the Americans in Indonesia, because you had the Indonesians who were looking to get out from under the yoke of the Dutch to be independent, and were counting on the Americans to help them, you know, to do that, while the Americans were sort of turning their eyes away and allowing, and I guess the British as well, and allowing the Dutch to try to recolonialize Indonesia. And she encountered a similar situation in Saigon, where she saw the stirrings of the nationalist movement among the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese wanted the Americans to help free them of the French, and the Americans weren't really doing it.
Yes.
And she was very sympathetic to these nationalist movements.
Yes, it was a very difficult position that the OSS was in, because the OSS was really, as we stated earlier, they were intellectuals. They were, I think for the most part, quite a liberal group. And they really were proponents of Roosevelt's New Deal. And part of their understanding finding of their mission in Southeast Asia was that Roosevelt promised many of these countries that if we helped them fight the Japanese, they would receive our support for their fledgling democracies. They had all been under colonial rule. These had all been territories that had been ruled by the French and the British and the Dutch for many, many years. But when the war ended, Roosevelt had died. Truman had taken over and had a very different point of view. And Truman was so busy rebuilding Europe, and he felt that he couldn't rebuild Southeast Asia as well. So he said to our European allies, who he was trying to placate, we'll back off. We'll have no jurisdiction in this part of the world, and you do what you think is best to rebuild. But that meant that the British and the Dutch and the French, they wanted to go back, right as it was before. They wanted their tea plantations and their tin plantations and their rubber plantations, and they wanted to put the brown man under the white thumb. Well, these people had been fighting for years. They had been armed. They had been taught how to resist, and they were not going to go back under colonial rule. And for the OSS, who had relied on them, had used them as agents, who had promised them help, this was devastating. And they were being shot in the streets and rounded up and arrested by the returning European colonial powers. And the OSS was appalled. And Jane personally was devastated because she had been a liaison to many of the political leaders, and she felt that she was betraying them.
Now, Paul and Julia were both sent to China, and this was while the war with Japan was still going on. And there was all kinds of very complex political things raging there. You had the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, you had the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, the French were there doing whatever they were doing. Then you had the atom bomb that's dropped on Japan. You had Soviet troops who are raping and looting. You have a flood. But this was also the place where Paul and Julia became close.
Yes.
Even sexually intimate in Chongqing. But they were an odd couple, weren't they?
They were such an odd couple. You know, he was a decade older, a head shorter. He was a loner. He was kind of a confirmed bachelor and a very difficult man. And he was one of those men that had a preset idea of the very elegant, beautiful, fashionable kind of woman that he saw himself with. He had lived in France for years, spoke impeccable French, loved fashion and literature, and he thought he was a connoisseur of women. And Julia was just to him a big, lanky tomboy. He sort of took her under his wing. He would refer to her in letters to his twin brother as a good kid. But he did not have a romantic interest in her. Even at the very end of the war, after they had had a bit of an affair, he still really didn't think that they were meant to be together. And when the war parted, he said, look, let's take some time apart and see if we still like each other in civilian clothes, because he just wasn't convinced. But oddly enough, Julia was smitten. She loved his intellect. She adored his artist's eye. She loved his passion for politics and literature and food. And she saw him as just a window on a whole new world. And she wrote in her diary that even if she couldn't have him as a husband, she wanted him as a best friend in her life forever. And she wouldn't let him go. And eventually she won him over.
So after the war, the OSS is disbanded, and basically its staff is subsumed back into the State Department. And Paul and Julia's OSS colleagues dispersed and had to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. She returned to her parents' home in Pasadena for a while. Paul went to Washington. Is that where he went? But then I guess she made her sort of last-ditch effort to win him and suggested that he come to visit and accompany her on a cross-country drive from California to Maine, during the course of which they fell in love.
They did.
She won him over. Why do you think he decided to marry her?
I think her warmth. I think that these were two profoundly lonely people. And the OSS, you know, being a secret intelligence service, was such a tight-knit family. And for all that time, 2.5 years, they had been like in camp together. They had been told where to go, what to do, when to eat. They had spent 24 hours a day together. And when they were all split up, they were really at sea, and their letters demonstrate how lonely they were, how isolated they were. And she reached out to him through these letters. She was so warm. She was so charismatic. She was so giving. She was so generous. He was really quite a difficult man. Mm-hmm. And she was incredibly supportive and encouraging of his career and his art.
He was, as you write, lucky to have her, right?
I think he was.
Okay.
And I think, to his credit, that he did always know that in later life and never forgot it. But I think he ultimately, she wore him down. He couldn't resist her.
So they get married. He gets posted to Paris because he's now working for the U.S. Information Service, that we now know as the U.S. Information Agency, I guess. And this is where she becomes fascinated by French cooking, starts taking cooking lessons. And in the meantime, you've got, these former OSS members who've been scattered about, who start to come under, be affected by the witch hunt, the communist witch hunt that's led by Joseph McCarthy. How did that affect former members of the OSS?
Well, it was very difficult for them. Paul Child was essentially in a propaganda job. His job in France, then later in Germany, was to do anti-communist propaganda and really publicize the glories of Western democracies and capitalism, because we were so worried, our former allies, the Russians during the war, were now marching through Europe, and all of these little Western democracies were right on the line as to whether they were going to go communist or stay democracies. We were pumping millions of dollars into France and Italy to try and shore up these governments and make sure they didn't become communist. So we were so petrified, and this fear of communism just seized the Truman administration, seized America, and we became convinced that there were spies everywhere. Some of those fears were justified. I mean, Klaus Fuchs had smuggled bomb secrets to the Russians, and the Russians got the atom bomb in '49. We had the Whittaker Chambers case. We had the Rosenberg case, which just monopolized the media for 3 years, and then they got the chair. And then on top of all of this, in 1949, China fell to the communists. Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic. Our candidate that we had been supporting for years, Chiang Kai-shek, had to flee to Taiwan. And so suddenly 2 major countries were communist, and we as Americans felt under siege. And there was a lot of finger pointing and blaming, and the Truman administration wanted to know how our OSS intelligence service leaders and our State Department officers could have so bungled the job. How could they not have seen this coming? How did China become communist?
And in fact, Paul Child was actually investigated for possible communist connections.
Yes, all these people started to be investigated. And of course, many of them, like Paul Child, were very, very liberal, as their friend Jane Foster was. And they saw that they had gone to communist meetings, that they had gone to union meetings, that they were very liberal in their political point of view and in their lifestyle. They were unconventional, they were artists, and they got full loyalty inquiries, as it was called in those days. And that was not a pretty business. They investigated your past, your employers, your family, your friends, and anything that was unconventional was used as dirt against you. And people had their careers turned upside down, their lives ruined.
Right. We're almost out of time. Paul was investigated. He was cleared. Jane Foster and her husband were actually arrested and charged with belonging to an alleged espionage scheme to sell secrets to the Soviets. And it was a very scary time for them. Fortunately, the Childs were able to escape from the worst of it and moved to Cambridge, where she became the Jewish child that we know, and they basically lived happily ever after, is my quick summary of it all. But it's it's really a fascinating story of the OSS and interest and what became of the people who worked for it at that time in history. So I want to thank you, Jennet Conant, for joining me today. A Covert Affair, Julia Child and Paul Child in the OSS has just been published by Simon & Schuster for the City University of New York and 1-to-1. I'm Sheryl McCarthy.